On April 22nd, 1970, 46 years ago, the very first Earth Day was celebrated. And Earth Day has continued to be held on April 22nd each year since. And today, Earth Day is celebrated in 173 countries around the world. That's almost 90% of the world's nations. This is our true Earth Day service. I think those of us who are younger, I was only 6 in 1970, forget just how significant that first Earth Day was for our country and for the world. On that day, 22 million Americans took to the streets in support of the Earth. Maybe some of you were in the streets that day. And their calls for change led really quite directly to the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, birthed a whole environmental movement that continues to this day. Just imagine 22 million people in the streets for the Earth. I'd like to see that happen again. Something huge was going on in America at that time, and it was in response to things that people could see all around them. Just the year before, in June of 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire. Yes, a river caught fire. It was so filled with industrial waste and oil that it was said that it oozed rather than flowed, and there was no sign of visible life in that river. And this is not as well known, it had caught fire 12 times before 1969. Last fall, in one of my sermons, I talked about the Wabash River in my hometown of Terre Haute, Indiana, and how as a child, when we played near the river, none of my friends, nor I, could imagine even putting our hands in that water, filled with chemicals from the industries upstream. So, in 1970, with that first Earth Day, people all over America said, enough, enough of this. And I think that that first Earth Day represented really a seismic shift in mainstream American views of nature. From really a pretty unquestioned view of nature as an endless resource, our personal food basket, source of raw material, and dumping ground, to an understanding of just how much our own destiny depends on a healthy planet, and how seriously we were damaging our environment right before our eyes. Of course, not everyone signed on Earth Day or since, and of course, those who benefited from the lack of regulation didn't give up trying to give everything they had and continue to do so to this day to stop and undermine and weaken environmental laws. But the conversation had changed irrevocably. We live in a different world than pre-1970 Earth Day. The relatively new science of ecology has taught us just how truly, genuinely, scientifically interrelated everything is, and how interdependent we are. This isn't a nice religious or philosophical idea. This is the way the world works. Maybe someday, this is my hope too, we won't need Earth Day, because we will really understand that every day that we are alive on this earth is Earth Day. We are celebrating Earth Day. We should be grateful for all that supports us and stand up to protect the air and water and fellow creatures of the world. What was once a radical view is now widely accepted. And even people who might reject the label environmentalist to their dying breath recycle and might think twice about pouring their car oil into the local storm drain that will lead to the river nearby. I think there's really been a change. But when I think about it, how did we ever come to believe the delusion that our destiny was somehow separate from the health of the planet? Indigenous people all over the world know this connection. We just did that Hopi chant. Read any of the great speeches of Native American leaders from the 19th century, and you can hear this understanding echoed again and again. And some of the world's religions teach this too. Today, I want to share Buddhist and Shinto wisdom and teachings about the earth. As many of you know, I've been a student of Buddhism for about 30 years, and I just recently returned from Japan on March 30th, where I was spending 2 weeks learning about the Shinto religion of Japan through living and participating in the daily life of a Shinto shrine, Tsubaki Grand Shrine, where about 1 million people visit each year. It's one of the major shrines. Shinto is a way of life and a relationship to the sacred that is thousands of years old in Japan and practiced by a vast majority of the people in Japan, right alongside Buddhism. It's not a problem there, as it is here, having multiple religions. Part of the reason I applied to the Unitarian Universalist Association to become this year's Tsubaki scholar was because, although I knew very little about Shinto, I think this is true of most of us, I knew it had deep teachings about the natural world, and I wanted to learn more. And I've been promising that I would tell stories, more stories about Japan, so I want to tell you one that is etched in my spirit. I was talking to Reverend Ochiai-san, the English-speaking Shinto priest who was kind of my handler while I was there. And he said, Shinto teaches that there is spirit in everything, that everything is alive, everything has spirit, everything is sacred, even trees and rocks. I have to admit, at first I thought he'd said locks, and I had this great image of the sacredness of locks, and then I realized it was rocks. It's like rocks, even rocks and trees. Although I think he'd say locks too, actually. I then tried to explain to him, across some degree of language barrier that we shared, that in traditional Western thought, the only things that are truly sacred are God and the human soul, and the things of the earth and even our own bodies are insentient matter, there for human use and domination. You know, the dominion over the earth thing that's in Genesis? He looked at me in absolute horror and disbelief. You would have thought I had just told him that we in the West have a long tradition of cannibalism. Although, come to think of it, it's not so different from cannibalism. This is a kind of cannibalism. I really think he only half believed me. It was such a foreign and disturbing idea to him. For my part, ever since that conversation, I have been considering what my life would be like if I lived with a sense that everything is sacred, everything is worthy of respect, and everything, without exception, has spirit. I mean, yes, I believe that, theoretically, but do I live it? Do I really live it? I don't think I do. Around almost every major Shinto shrine, like Tsubaki Grand Shrine, within the brilliant red torii gates that mark the entrance, there is a shrine forest. And this forest is essentially old growth. The cedars and cypresses there are hundreds, sometimes more than hundreds of years old, thousands even. Their trunks are like giant columns in an outdoor cathedral. And every morning, winter and summer, the priests sweep the gravel paths that lead from one building to another that are nestled in the forest, all before the day's pilgrims arrive, carefully removing literally the smallest piece of leaf or bark that might be on the path, and then they place it underneath the trees away from the paths so that it will decompose and feed the trees above. And I joined each morning in that silent sweeping, only stopping to say "Ohayo gozaimasu," good morning, to the earliest visitors that might be coming through, because a Shinto shrine is never closed. There are no walls or gates to keep anyone out. I remember hearing years ago that there's a shrine in Japan where women bring their old bent sewing needles to do ceremonies to express their appreciation for the needle's many years of service. What would it mean to treat all things with that kind of appreciation, to honor a bent needle, a plastic bag, a piece of torn paper, my own body, in just that way? And don't get me wrong, I am not idealizing modern Japanese capitalist culture, which is in thrall to consumption and resource extraction just as much as we are. But I am saying that while I was there, I encountered an understanding that is so different from the ideas that lie at the religious foundation of our culture, and I really felt it. So Buddhism, which is also in Japan, began in India 2,500 years ago and spread throughout Asia. It arrived in Japan in about the 6th century, and Zen Buddhism, which is the form of Buddhism that I have mostly practiced, arrived in the early 12th century. So compared to Shinto, Buddhism in Japan is a relative upstart. It's only 1,500 years old there. But Buddhism also has deep and powerful teachings about the natural world. The great Japanese Buddhist teachers Kukai and Dogen both taught, and we have their writings, that the whole world is permeated by Buddha nature, by enlightenment itself. Even plants and trees and walls and pebbles and locks embody Buddha nature. And an ecological view is right at the heart of the original Buddhist teaching of dependent co-origination, that all the elements and beings of the world ceaselessly are interdependent and are interrelated in an infinitely complex dance of cause and effect. That's the actual world we live in. Deep ecology, as a Western philosophical movement, suggests that we need a more thoroughgoing environmental ethic. It's not enough to say, we human beings are going to help the planet. One that recognizes that what we call self and what we call the environment are not two different things. It's not jobs versus the environment, people. You know, we are the environment, and the environment is us. It is not, these are not separate ideas. So how can we widen our circle of compassion from self to family to friends to community to the web of life and beyond? Arnie Ness, one of the founders of the deep ecology movement, wrote, "Unhappily, the extensive moralizing within the ecological movement has given the public the false impression that they are being asked to make a sacrifice, to show more responsibility, more concern, and a nicer moral standard. But all that would flow naturally and easily if the self, the idea of the self, were widened and deepened so that the protection of nature was felt and perceived as protection of our very selves." Let me read that again. So that the protection of nature was felt and perceived as protection of our very selves. These days, 46 years after the first Earth Day and after many environmental victories of many kinds, we have much worse fears than burning rivers. Now, as we heard so eloquently read by Nicolette from Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, the future of all life, including our own, depends on our mindful steps. I think most of us, and I include myself, are asleep or half asleep still to what is being required of us. We have never before in our whole history as a species known such responsibility, or at least been aware of such responsibility. And it's daunting. I think it's so daunting that we prefer not to think about it most of the time. And we feel helpless and powerless in the face of such a global problem. What can we do? What difference can we make? That's the sort of thing we say to ourselves, And so we read the newspaper, and we feel despair, and we do nothing. But there is a teaching from Buddhism and from ecology that I find very, very helpful in the face of that feeling of powerlessness and helplessness. If, as both teach and as our UU 7th principle reminds us, everything is connected and interdependent, then every single action that you and I take matters. Matters for our whole future. Affects more things than we can possibly imagine going forward. We are not powerless. We are actually tremendously powerful and tremendously responsible. What if we lived that way? If we knew that every action matters. The contemporary Buddhist eco-philosopher Joanna Macy wrote a book called Active Hope, about facing this time of great change and great responsibility with an open and willing heart. And in it she wrote, "Active hope is not wishful thinking. Active hope is not waiting to be rescued by the Lone Ranger or by some savior. Active hope is waking up to the beauty of life on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world. The web of life is calling us forth at this time. We've come a long way, and we're here to play our part. With active hope, we realize that there are adventures in store, strength to discover, and comrades to link arms with. Active hope is a readiness to engage. Active hope is a readiness to discover the strengths in ourselves and in others, a readiness to discover the reasons for hope and the occasions for love. A readiness to discover the size and strength of our hearts, our quickness of mind, our steadiness of purpose, our own authority, our love for life, the liveliness of our curiosity, the unsuspected deep well of patience and diligence, the keenness of our senses, and our capacity to lead. None of these can be discovered in an armchair or without risk."